right. Well, greetings, welcome. We have people here in the room classroom. We also have people online for the Zoom version of this, so a split hybrid class. Today's class is about growing vegetables for the fall, winter, and overwintered garden. And it kind of is funny to be talking about the winter garden when we haven't even quite hit solstice yet, and I'm still planting main season crops. But the fact is, timing is critical to fall and winter gardening. You have to do the right things at the right time or you don't succeed. And that season starts now, late June to early July. So especially if you're starting your own seed for transplants, it really cuts that season a lot. So this is why we do this class now, while you still have time to cogitate, evaluate, and take steps to move into actually doing the process. So with that, are you not? Oh no. Oh no. There we go. Don't know why it didn't like moving, but now it's moving. We talk about the winter garden. Year-round gardening. The winter garden is fall harvested crops. Now I exclude from this talk crops that you start back in April or May that are just that long, like sweet potatoes. That's not really fall gardening in my book. The crops you're harvesting October and November. It's also winter harvest crops. There aren't a lot, but there are things you can be harvesting and eating fresh out of the garden in November, December, January. And then crops that are overwintered for harvest the following spring or even summer. That harvest range is from maybe the very end of February all the way through June, July on a few of the crops. So there's some very long sequence crops in overwinter gardening. So it's really kind of three gardens, and you have to kind of evaluate what you need, when you need it, and how that fits into the rest of your gardening. Because if you're putting a crop in that you're not harvesting until June, July, that is occupying garden space next main crop season as well. So you have to kind of take that into account. And those kind of rotations are part of the challenge of making this work efficiently. So fall harvest crops and extended harvest crops. So leaf crops, some of them you planted in the spring, you harvest all summer, you can harvest through the fall, you can harvest into winter. Others you can plant in the summer for fall or into winter harvests, extended harvests. A lot of cole crops. So your cole crops are what people typically think of as traditional cold season fall crops: broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kohlrabi, those kinds of crops in the crucifer family. And then root crops. Root crops are a lot of them are fall harvested. Many of the fall crops can also be ground stored to harvest later into the year, and a few of them naturally finish later in the year. And then legumes, which when we're talking about fall harvest legumes, we're talking about peas. Leaf crops for fall harvest include chards and collards, all kinds of mustard greens, chicories, lettuce, spinach, kale. So kind of some traditional patterns, things like collards, mustard greens, chicories. You're typically, and lettuces, you're typically doing a separate planting. You can plant them in the spring for summer harvest, or you plant them in summer for fall to winter harvest. And you kind of have to separate them because they kind of go south right about now as the day lengths are getting at their peak and the temperatures start coming up. So a little different cycle on those. On the other hand, things like chard and kale, your spring plantings normally stay good all through they're basically biennial crops. They stay good through the summer harvest. You harvest into fall. Depending on how much protection you're willing to give them and what the actual winter weather is like, you might do some harvesting over the winter, and then they put on a whole big flush of growth in the spring that you can harvest right before they bolt and go to seed. Cole crops, very traditional. So broccoli, understand that fall broccoli is just like spring broccoli, and overwintered broccoli is different. Brussels sprouts, an underutilized crop. Once you learn how to cook them in a palatable manner, and you learn how to keep the aphids out of them, they offer a wide range of harvest seasons from a single planting because they hold in the ground really well. Cabbages and cauliflowers, you plant in the summer, and you plant all kinds of different varieties if you're really going to maximize your season extent. at the same time, and they have different maturation periods. So you can plant 4 varieties of cabbage in the summer that harvest October and November and January and March, all from the same planting time, just different varieties, and that applies for cauliflower as well. Kohlrabi is a crop that can be grown spring for summer, but if planted in the summer, it harvests in the fall, and it holds well in the field without much deterioration, which isn't always true of root crops. It's actually a stem crop, technically, not actually a root. And fall harvest root crops, beets and carrots are the traditional fall, of course. Parsnips, edging fall, because parsnips are really often more into winter. Radishes are fun because you can plant small amounts of radish repetitively throughout the season with 3 to 4 week turnarounds from seed to harvest. And you can plant them all the way into maybe early October if we have a long fall and still get a harvest that season. Now, radishes are reasonably hardy, but there are some limits to their hardiness depending on how cold our winters really get. And then leeks. If your leeks are already in the ground, that's probably summer to fall harvest. If you're thinking about planting leeks now, that's winter to spring harvest. That takes them a very long time to mature. Fall harvest legumes is primarily peas. Planting right now, growing through the summer cycle, will get you a crop that's ripening usually around August. You could plant in July and get a crop into September. You can do some later plantings, but you start looking at them being an overwintered crop. And overwintered crops on peas are pretty hit and miss, though doable. Your winter crops. Again, we have winter leaf crops. There's not many root crops that are primarily winter, but a lot of root crops can hold well into winter. And there are some winter-specific colds. Your winter leaf crops are really limited. So what happens with winter leaf crops, a lot of them are plenty hardy, but they don't grow enough in the winter for active harvest unless you're taking steps to insulate, to give some temperature protection. So even the ones that survive and are hardy may not be very productive without some extra steps. Some of the best actual winter harvested leaves include arugula and other mustard greens, collards, which are much best after a couple of good hard frosts, kale, which grows slowly and incrementally all through the winter. And as long as you're minimally harvesting, you can continue to harvest through the winter well. On the other hand, things like spinach and chard and lettuce, many times they will survive the winter even without covers. If you cover them, you can extend your harvest later into the winter from your fall harvest, or you can get them to winter over for a spring harvest. Without covers, that gets a little more hit and miss. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And then many of the chicories are really good for winter harvest as well. They come on late. They're good. They're good after a couple of frosts. You can choose to whole harvest your chicories, taking whole plants out for processing or eating, or you can harvest outer leaves lightly, in which case they will usually overwinter and you'll get a nice flush up in the spring. Your winter cole crops, Brussels sprouts is really a standing crop from fall harvest. You really had a goal to hit this about Thanksgiving, but the ones you didn't eat by Thanksgiving are still there, and they're still slowly maturing up the stem. So you're picking your Brussels sprouts off the base of the stem, working your way up, and they continue to hold. Winter harvest Brussels sprouts will winter better if you don't take off all the wilty leaves and hanging stuff. If you don't try to keep them bare stemmed. It gives them a little extra insulation. The trade-off is it may increase some of your slug damage, and it makes it harder to see aphids. Aphids don't stop in the winter, they just slow down, just like a lot of our crops. Winter cabbage, there's several varieties that are slated typically for December to January harvests from a summer planting. And similarly with winter cauliflower. It's important to note that cauliflower is not very hardy. The plant is. The part you're eating, the crown, is not. Start taking damage somewhere in the mid to low 20s. So winter harvest and overwintered cauliflower usually needs some sort of freeze protection or frost protection materials. Kohlrabi is like Brussels sprouts. It's typically slated for October or November harvest, but it holds pretty well in the field up until we get really cold. Try to get it out before winter solstice anyway, but December harvests are usually quite good. Ground stored roots are really kind of variable. It does depend on your soil moisture and what your insect and slug pressure is like in your garden. If you have a lot of wireworm problems, a lot of soil symphyllans, you're probably going to have trouble getting your crops to ground store. The benefit, though, is to have something you can actually get out of the garden without having to figure out how you're going to store it in November, December, January into February. So beets up through midwinter, mid-December, maybe up to Christmas, mostly hold pretty well if you're not saturated or your insect pressure isn't too bad. But much later than that, they start getting forky, tough, and they start losing quality pretty fast. Carrots often hold actually better clear up to winter solstice, but they still decline once you get past that and they want to start regrowing the tops. Tops die down completely. When they're ready to start resprouting tops, very late winter, January into early February, the carrots have gotten all corky again and hairy. They're no longer really good quality carrots for eating. Turnips have some problems for winter storing, but rutabagas, their close cousins, actually hold up really well, really late into the season. And that's one of the few crops I'm harvesting out of my garden in December and January. Parsnips are the ground stored crop champion of the root crops. They're the ones that hold up the best under all kinds of poor weather conditions and in even relative insect pressure. It takes a real long time to grow them, but these are easy crops for January, February harvests. Then overwintered crops, again, we have leaves, coles, roots, and a couple of legumes. Overwintered leaf crops are the same candidates we kind of been talking about, mustards of various types, including arugula. Corn salad, also known as mash or vit, is a crop that doesn't get enough attention. It's kind of a peasant's crop in origin, as a weed crop in wheat fields originally in Europe. It typically is lightly winter harvested in the cold part of the season, but it flushes up really big in the spring. And one of the big benefits to mash or corn salad, it's not related to anything else in your garden. So you don't have to worry about pest and disease accumulation. It's a completely different family from anything else you're growing in the vegetable garden. Chard and kale are truly biennial. The trick with these guys as an overwintered crop is to do your light harvesting through the winter as need be, and chard often dies back and then comes back where kale normally stays up. They flush earlier than you think. You'll start seeing the new growth really pushing roughly mid-February. Start light harvesting then. As the growth accelerates through the spring, harvest a little heavier outside and bottommost leaves working up. And then they'll suddenly really push out late February, March, maybe mid-March, depending on weather. I've seen it be as late as late March here, but usually sometime in March before we're actually into April, they're going to try to start setting a flower. They start setting the seed. And at that point, that bolting stage, the quality of the crop goes down and nothing you do is going to stop that from happening. They have completed their life cycle. They've met their goal. They're going to reproduce. So harvest what you can salvage at that point as those flower stalks begin, and then pull the crops out of the ground, make way for new crops. The timing on that is great because you're getting these crops out of the ground March to April, when you finally get the stubs out of the ground, just before you're ready to come through and plant your main season garden again. Spinach. So spinach is planted for fall harvest. If you cover it, will winter lightly harvested and can overwinter. Spinach, even uncovered, may winter here, but it will do nothing. It will sit there as little tiny stubs. You can barely see where they are. And then it'll flush out in the spring for one final push. It's a brief push on spinach before it bolts, so enjoy it while it lasts. Overwintered cabbage and cauliflower, we've talked about a bit because it's those are the same variety or different varieties planted at the same time for different stages of harvest. Typical overwintered cabbage and overwintered cauliflower are February or March, a few of them a little end of March into early April. Cabbage is quite hardy here. We don't normally have any problems with needing winter protection on them, but cauliflower definitely does need that protection to make it through as an overwintered crop. Sprouting broccoli is nothing like normal broccoli. So your fall broccoli and your spring broccoli are your typical big heads, and spring broccoli, of course, you cut the heads, you get the side shoot production with all the little florets all over the place. Sprouting broccoli is tall and spindly and is nothing but little florets everywhere. And that's what you harvest usually February to March. Oh, sprouting broccoli is normally quite hardy. I did lose a crop at 2 below 0 one year. And water does matter. If you're in standing water, they're not gonna hold really well.
Does it taste like broccoli?
It tastes like broccoli, a slightly different from main head broccoli, but yeah, it's still brock. It's just like harvesting side shoots, just lots of them. It happens in, usually I get 2 or 3 cuttings off of my overwintered that are small cuttings. You plant 4 or 5 plants, you don't get huge amounts. You're not going to get them all out at once, because by the time the last ones of the crop are beginning to set bud down here, your first ones are already flowered. So take them as they swell before they actually start separating for flower development, and take them in 2 or 3 cuttings to make sure you maximize your yield. Overwintered root crops. Now we're talking about some different stuff. Onions, garlic, and shallots. These are some of the best introductory crops for overwinter gardening, because they're high success rate crops. You'll have varying degrees of success. You seldom have abject complete failure. So good learning crops. These are all crops that their maturation is regulated by the day length, not by how long they've been in the ground. So you can plant them in summer or fall, or theoretically as late as maybe February, March, with just differences in yield, but they still mature at the same time, regulated by how long the days are. It does vary a little bit from variety to variety. Typically, I mean, I'm going to be picking onions probably 2 weeks, but garlic next week for my overwintered crops. Shallots usually somewhere in there too. Again, varieties vary a bit. So the typical pattern for these is to plant bulbs in the fall for overwintering. If you want more varieties than are available from bulbs for onion, you have to buy seeds or seedlings, and you start the seeds in late June, early July for transplant, July to August for overwintering, 200 days, roughly 180 to 200 days from seed to finished crop. Garlic is almost never done by seed. Shallots are seldom done by seed. Mostly they are the bulbs. We'll talk a little bit more about some detail about the planting on onions, because there's another option out there that you might consider. Now, we talked about carrots being a fall crop and a winter ground stored crop. Now, most varieties of carrots don't make it the full cycle. If you accidentally leave them in the ground, you try to harvest them in April, they're no good. They don't taste right. They're woody, they're whatever. They're not of any quality. There are some specific varieties that are designed for overwinter gardening. The ones you're most likely to see are Autumn King and Merida. You plant them later. You plant them September, maybe October, with the goal of April harvest as an overwintered crop. They're some of the sweetest carrots you'll ever taste done that way. They are a little bit irregular in my soil, but that's a lot because of my soil moisture rather than temperature considerations. And then overwintered legumes, peas, short bush peas, not tall pole peas, can be overwintered. A seeding done in September, maybe very early October at the latest, will often produce in March, April. So well ahead of even February started seed. But there's a lot that can go wrong with peas between here and there. They have a number of insect pests that occur over the winter. They grow, but they grow very slowly. And they're subject to a lot of not cold damage, but inclement weather damage, hailstorms, snow, ice, like this last winter, ice storms, flooding, all things that can impact your peas. Even a really hard rainstorm can break pea plants because they're not super robust. So covers give you a much better chance of making that. Really short statured varieties do better than taller varieties. Worth playing with to expand your growing season, but don't bet your entire pea crop on it, because it's more subject to issues. Favas are almost always grown as an overwintered crop here. Seeding in September-ish, as early as August, as late as early October, for May to June harvests of favas. They can freeze out here. It really seems to be pretty variable. It's often not just the absolute temperature. Most of the fava varieties that we're doing that are not cover crop favas, that are the big seeded favas for human consumption, are nominally hardy somewhere around like 10 degrees-ish. We don't often get that cold, but we do sometimes get that cold. But I've seen them survive colder weather when they were well established and when that cold wasn't accompanied by tons of snow and ice. On the other hand, I've seen them fail on 18-degree winters when we've had lots and lots of snow and ice. So intermittent crop for that reason, but that is the normal, probably the broadest way of doing it, though you can spring seed them as well. Okay, so that's our kind of overview. We're going to go through some crop by crop descriptions, and we'll talk a little bit more about implementing this fall and winter garden concept. Arugula is a brassica. It's a mustard green, so it's in the crucifer alliance, just like all your cole crops and a whole batch of the root and leaf crops. Arugula is a relatively quick maturing crop. It can be grown throughout the year, but it's best early in the spring or late as a fall and winter crop. If you plant seeds in July or August, or transplant as late as early September, you can get a fall to winter crop. And if you're looking at those later planting ends of that, and you really want the winter crop, you're going to get definitely a better persistence as a winter crop or as an overwintered crop with covers. We'll talk a little bit more about covers specifically at the end. Generally, you're going to seed dense if you're direct sowing. You can also start them in cell packs yourself and transplant them. You can buy 6-packs. It's pretty common to have them in the nurseries. But you want to plant them or thin them to about a 9-inch spacing to allow plenty of room for the individual plant leaf to develop. They're a moderate fertilizer demand. By crucifer standards, they're not very hungry at all, but compared to some of the other crops, they're very moderate. Water needs to be pretty consistent on the front end of that cycle. They're liable to failure if you get them really hot and really dry, or to at least flavor inconsistency if you get them too hot and dry early in the season. Watch for beetles, particularly in the early end of the season. Aphids are an intermittent problem on arugula, but can be, and slugs are just a nuisance and menace on arugula planting. So get them controlled early rather than late. For any kind of consistent harvest, it's one thing to plant a batch and get just one big harvest out and eat on that for a few weeks until you're through it. But if you want to have that sporadic harvest through the cold season, you definitely need to harvest very lightly and frequently rather than doing larger harvests all at once, because they will just stop if you take too much in the midwinter cycle. Chard, biennial crop. I usually plant my chard in the spring, grow it as a main season crop, harvest all summer, harvest it in the fall. I don't normally cover it. I just let it dormant down, and then I get a flush of growth most springs thereafter. I lost it this winter. That 4 inches of ice storm did kill it. You know, 4 days of ice storm killed it. But on an average winter, it does make it through and I get a good flush up. Surprisingly drought tolerant. I have dry gardened them. They have a root like a beet, which is not surprising. They're related. Give them adequate space. You can direct sow seed, you can plant transplants, but do plan on either planting to or thinning to about a 10 or 12-inch spacing between plants for good size performance. They don't need lots of fertilizer. They can be on the dry end of moderate on watering, and you're again harvesting mostly outer older leaves first towards the center crown to keep the growing tip growing. If you do get a early bolt sprout, you'll notice that instead of the normal flat leaf stalks, you'll get kind of an angular, almost square stalk coming up, and rather than producing big leaves, it'll produce a lot of little tiny leaves, and it's going to try to flower. You might be able to, if it's late summer or early fall, you might be able to chop that and get it to reflush foliage. But ultimately what's going to happen is they're going to grow normally over the winter, and they'll do that in the spring the following year. Okay. When it happens in the spring, just harvest the leaves out and get them out. You're not going to stop it. But if you stop it in late summer, early fall, you might be able to get some continued leaf harvest off of that. They bolt early. Surprisingly early. Late February is pretty common for me to start losing my chard that I overwinter. Beetles can be a problem. Powdery mildew is pretty significant, less so in the spring and summer garden, but as a fall and winter garden problem, it's fairly significant. They're relatively susceptible. Leaf miners on these guys is the real big problem. So leaf miners fly, lays its eggs, the larva tunnels between the two dermis layers of the leaf, so it's harder to control. We will talk a little bit more about individual pest control at the end, but that's something you definitely want to watch out for on chard. Chicory. So chicory is kind of a big catch-all group for a whole batch of plants, radicchio and endive and escarole. They're a lot slower than arugula to develop out, but they're actually quite hardy and durable crops and can be very productive. We'll normally be planting from seed in July or transplanting in August for fall to winter harvests. They can overwinter another smaller crop in the spring if you're not whole plant harvest. A lot of people like a whole plant harvest. It's really easy. Just take them, wash them. They like most of the greens, they'll refrigerate reasonably well if you get them good and clean and dry before you stick them in the fridge. They have a relatively moderate fertilizer and water requirement, so not particularly hungry, not particularly thirsty. Less pest problems overall than a lot of the crucifer leaf crops. Slugs are definitely an issue. Aphids can be a problem. Thrips are a little bit more of a problem on chicory. It's another sucking feeder that's actually smaller than an aphid and can be a little bit harder to spot the damage. They're in the daisy family. So we have chicories and lettuce in the daisy family and not a whole lot else. So again, for crop rotations, it's a useful intermittent crop or interstitial crop. Collards, another crucifer crop, similar to kale maybe in many regards, where you don't see huge flavor differences typically among kale between fall harvest, winter harvest. Collards really is at its best after a couple of really good brisk freezes to change the sugar content a little bit. It's a big plant by leaf crop standards. These are something you want to plant at or thin to about an 18-inch spacing to allow plenty of space for leaf development. And accordingly, a very high yielding plant, very good for overall volume of greens produced. Harvest continuously from the bottom and outside up, and you can harvest them way into the winter. You might get a good overwintered flush if everything goes smoothly and you don't over harvest, and then they will bolt out in the spring and they'll be done. Like all the crucifer crops, they're really susceptible to beetles. We have to watch caterpillars, especially these summer plantings. So when you're used to doing a lot of spring planting for summer harvest, we have insect problems, sure. But the crops are starting with the young plants at a point in time when the insect populations are relatively low and relatively low in activity level. For fall and winter crops, we are planting in the peak of insect activity, really height of summer. Almost maximum insect population pressure. So you have to be a lot more attentive to these, especially in the early stages. So beetles and caterpillars are early season problems. And then slugs and aphids continue all through the winter as problems. So you need to pay attention, not just in the fall, but as we go through the cycle. Root maggots on crucifer crops are pretty significant and need to be paid attention to for these summer plantings. It is a really variable situation in my garden. I sometimes have problems and sometimes don't. If you're having ongoing problems with crucifer crops with root maggots, it's well worth investing in some insect barrier and just planning to cover emergent seedlings or young transplants, because the damage starts young, and once the plants are hand size or taller, they're no longer subject to root maggot attack. The flies aren't laying the eggs for the plants that size anymore. Mash or vit, honeysuckle family, it's a caprifoliaceae. Very late planting potential. You can plant them clear into October and still have spring harvests over winter. If you want to get some winter harvest out of them, you need to get them in the ground maybe the end of August. Normally done by seed, direct sown. You can start your own transplants and plant them out. You seldom see corn salad available as transplant, though occasionally. They're a relatively small leaf crop. You put 6 or 8 inches apart is plenty of space for them. And the most common approach is to seed them prolifically and then harvest whole plants as they grow at slightly variable rates from plant to plant as you need them. If you're doing that, of course, you're likely to finish out your harvest fairly quick in the season. Covers are not usually needed for overwintering, but you will definitely get better yield from covering even overwintered. And if you're looking for winter harvests, you probably should cover. You're probably not going to get enough growth to have much harvest. Very easy plant to grow. They're kind of, I say, their origin is kind of a weed. So rather moderate in fertilizer demand. And as late as we're planting, they sometimes need 1 or 2 waterings, and then the fall rains take over and they hardly need any care. So a very easy and successful crop to play with. Good nutritional values. Kale, like chard, biennial, I almost always plant my kale early in the spring, harvest it spring, summer, fall. Light harvests over the winter. It does tend to keep growing slowly, and then a big flush in the spring before it bolts. Big-ish plants, does depend on the variety of kale, but 15 or 18 inches apart is where you're going to be looking for minimum spacings. Now, let's say these spacings like this, assuming that you're putting long rows of identical crops all together, right? That's not the way I garden. That's not the way necessarily a lot of people garden. So this is kind of some guidelines for how much overall space the plant is taking up. You're going to have to adapt those numbers for yourself, depending on access through the garden, access to harvest and care for, that kind of thing. If you're doing a single row of plants 18 inches apart, you'd have no problem. If you do a 4 foot by 4 foot block with all the plants 18 inches apart, plants in the center are going to suffer from lack of attention more than anything else, and they're going to be really hard to handle. So bear in mind, these guidelines are kind of based on row crop spacings. They're relative, like a lot of crucifers, relatively hungry, surprisingly drought tolerant, although if you're actually summer planting, you will definitely need to keep on top of your watering while they're young. But feed them really consistently so you get a good growth coming up. If you harvest oldest leaves, bottom, outside, working your way up, they will continue to produce through the winter. You will have a crop February to March before they bolt. Beetles, intermittent problem for me. Caterpillars a little bit bigger. Birds. So, funny thing about birds, you get a lot of sparrows and finches in the garden. That's great. They spend a lot of time on the kale plants and they peck the heck out of them. But one of the things you'll notice is that the kale plants that the birds are spending time on, yes, the leaves are tattered, but they have few or no aphids or beetles on them. So one of those anecdotal stories, Red Revolution in China. They decided, the Chinese government decided that starvation issues are saying the sparrows, they're eating too much of the crops. So they put a bounty on sparrows. You got pictures from the 50s of these school kids with these stringers of hundreds of dead sparrows they collected for a bounty. Fast forward 6 or 7 years, they were importing sparrows from Russia because the insect problems had gotten so bad that it was unmanageable. Okay, so learning toleration of levels of damage and what is a problem for you as a consumer versus the insect control, just bear that in mind. Aphids are a chronic problem on kale, like with most crucifers, and because the kale are standing all winter, you get build up slowly large populations of aphids on the kale plants. So do pay good attention to them. Starting off with water spritzing early, just literally washing the aphids off, moving on to insecticides, organic insecticides if needed. But you need to get those aphids under control in August or September at the latest, obviously if you're spring growing them earlier than that, because you're not likely to really completely suppress those populations through the winter. You're just not going to be out there enough to notice when the outbreak is getting bad. Lettuce, nice traditional salad green, much hardier than people think. We think of it as a summer crop, but it actually hates the hottest parts of summer. Actually grows really well spring and fall into winter. Can survive over winter with minimal or in some cases no cover, depending on how bad a winter we get. So really quite an easy crop to go. Plant, yes.
When you talk about cover, do you mean the fleece covers or like
Yeah.
poly?
No, we're mostly talking about floating in our area of Western Oregon. We're talking about mostly floating row covers, so fleece or remade fabrics.
Okay.
Now, certainly if you're going to maximize your harvest, you might look at poly fabrics or even hard covers that give you more insulative value. But generally minimal cover, we're talking about, yeah, remade fleece blankets, absolutely. So relatively quick turnaround, 45 or 50 days from seed in peak season, a little bit slower these times of the year, of course. I have transplanted seedlings of lettuce out in February and in fact, that's what I'm eating on right now is my February transplants. I have direct sown lettuce in late January and got lettuce but the crop I sowed in late March behind it did better, produced more and sooner. So bear that in mind. What you can do isn't always what you should do. Repeated plantings, starting in spring, continuing in the midsummer, and then later, will give you some continuous harvest. Definite advantages to planting your lettuce for your winter garden in the shade of tall plants. They really do hate that July, August heat. If you can get them established where they're getting a little protection, by the time those big summer crops are done, the lettuce will be nice and robust going into winter. Minimum spacing for healthy leaf lettuce is about 12 inches. Heads could be a little bit further. I plant mine way denser than that and I have good yields, but honestly, you could maximize more by giving them a little bit more space. They need to be fed consistently. They're a surprisingly hungry leaf crop, so feed them well and consistently through their growing cycle for continuing harvest. If you do focus on harvesting outside leaves, be aware that they elongate. And in the early parts of the season for late summer and fall harvest, I will normally alternate some side harvests versus topping out and making them rebranch the head for leaf lettuces. Because otherwise they will tend to bolt really fast. If you can do that a couple of times early season, then by winter, you are literally just harvesting the oldest leaves and you'll have several heads for bolting. You'll get a decent amount of yield before they bolt out. Slugs are probably my biggest issue with them. They could have a number of other minor pests, but slugs are a chronic problem in the lettuce garden. And like the chicories, they're in the composite, the daisy family. So a good crop to rotate amongst all these other crucifers that you have to be worried about disease pressures with. Mustard greens, another quick, and it's a big group. It's kind of hard to generalize. Wild mustard greens versus tatsoys and some of those Asian mustards. Lots of options out there, but generally speaking, they're quick maturing crops, 30, 40, 45 days. There's some of them are really spicy, others of them are almost just cabbagey, quite a range of flavors to play with. You can direct sow in the ground better than almost any other crucifer cole crop. They tolerate that better, or you can start seeds and then transplant. You can often buy transplants for mustard greens, especially for mixed varieties. If you're transplanting, you're talking about August to September for planting for fall and winter harvests. Plant out or thin at about 8-inch spacing. Some variety there. There are some smaller ones. There's not a lot that are going to be substantially bigger than that. You need to fertilize and water them well. They're shallow rooted. They don't have a lot of root space expanse wise either. So feeding needs to be available to the plant, and water particularly needs to not go away. Covers will persist your harvest into winter, and slugs and aphids. Sometimes some other things. We see a fair amount of beetle damage on certain times of the year on your mustards as well. My big problem is aphids in mustards. Yes.
So what you mentioned the lettuce and this particular crop as being a little bit on the hungrier side. Is it better to load up front and transplant them into a well fertilized area, or keep side dressing every couple of weeks?
So that's a really good question. So the question, I know the people at home can't quite hear that from the classroom. Is it better with these hungry crops to front load lots of fertilizer, lots of soil prep, or is it better to sequentially feed? And the answer is it depends. Short maturation crops that you're really intending to flush a crop and then just get them out, definitely front load it, lots of fertilizer. If you are intending to winter harvest or overwinter, you want to give them a decent feeding at the beginning, but then sequentially feed. Now, if you're using organics, which we strongly recommend for the edible garden, and you're using granular organics, those work great in August and September. By October, with our day length shortening and our soil temperatures plummeting, organic granular fertilizers lose effectiveness. They just kind of sit there. They're all dependent upon soil microbiology to break down the components of that fertilizer into forms that plants can use. And that condition persists from roughly October through roughly February. So if you're going for long sustained harvests, look at doing some liquid organic fertilization every 2 or 3 weeks through the season to keep them flushing. Because they can absorb that. It's in a soluble nutrient form. It's not dependent upon the soil microbiology anymore. So watch that. And on a lot of these crops, that's a thing. When we do this a lot with garlic and onions too, for the same reason. We want to make sure we get lots of fertilizer into them in forms they can use. Spinach, majorly as a spring crop. I've got a nice crop out there in the garden. It's haven't completely bolted out yet. Very cold tolerant for early plantings. Also good on the fall end from late summer plantings for fall harvest, and really lousy on most varieties in that period between the end of June and maybe the middle of August. They do not tolerate heat well. You can sometimes grow them in the shade of larger plants. So you can direct sow or transplant. They're pretty easy both, but easier from seed than transplant. But pretty easy both ways if you make sure your transplants are not overgrown and already stunted when you get them. Transplant out or thin to about a 6-inch spacing for most varieties for good yield, and fertilize consistently and well. They're short cycle crops for the most part, again 45-50 days, so a good load up front will do it for one-time harvest. Real common for me to do this as a late summer planting, get a light fall harvest, just winter them with covers. I do cover them for that, and then have a decent spring harvest before I have to go replant for the next batch. I never was a spinach fan much. I always used chard because it was so much easier, but in the last few years I've been doing a lot more kind of specialty pastas and stuff like that, and I do find that it's worth the investment of growing the spinach versus subbing chard or kale and having to counter flavor around the slight flavor differences. If you are going to continue the harvest early enough in its growing cycle or late enough into the fall, if you harvest the outermost leaves, you can continue a harvest out again, and covers extend that season fairly well into the winter and are really valuable if you're trying to overwinter it. Leaf miners on the earlier plantings are a serious problem, just like with beets and chard. And slugs are a real significant problem for me in the garden. I do have occasional beetle problems on them as well, but those are the two big ones. All right, so that's through the main leaf crops. Now we're on to the cole crops. Broccoli, spring and fall crop are just big-headed and can be grown for overwinter, but those are sprouting broccolis. If you're going for a fall harvest brock, you want to be transplanting early to mid-July, really. If you're going for a overwintered broccoli, you can push that clear into August and still have a crop as long as you feed them well. They do not direct sow well. Few of the cole crops do. So you're definitely ahead to either buy transplants or start your own seed for transplanting. If you're starting your own, you need to plant about 5 weeks from seed to transplantable size. Broccoli in all forms are big plants that need lots of space access to nutrients. So allow at least 24 inches between plants. And they're hungry. Fertilize well. They're also relatively long cycles, so feed a couple of times. Normally on a granular feed for a fall harvest, feed them at planting and feed them about 4 weeks later. That'll get you through. Overwintering, I will often do a little bit of liquid feeding as they start pushing up in the spring. Harvest whole heads in the fall or the sprouts in 2 or 3 cycles for the sprouting types in February. They're normally hardy enough to not require covers. I always suffer from aphids in the broccoli and the cauliflower. It's very hard to keep them controlled in those crops, and they get down inside the heads where they're very hard to wash out and salvage the crop. You might consider using covers for aphid control rather than for temperature control on these really high aphid-prone crops. Beetles and caterpillars on the early parts of the season are a significant issue, as are root maggots right at seedling emergence or early transplant stages. Brussels sprouts. One of these days it's such a great crop. One of these days I will learn a way that I actually like. I've had good Brussels sprouts in restaurants. My cooking skills are not up to making good Brussels sprouts. I'll confess that right here. But a crop that it takes a while to grow, but you can harvest fall and winter clear into the winter, even near to solstice, or super hardy crops. Huge advantage, and they're very productive crops. Typical planting is July to August for transplant. Do not push late on your Brussels. They take longer than broccoli and cauliflower to mature. So get on the game with them. If you're starting your own seed, you need to be doing that. You should have been doing that a couple of weeks ago, early June, basically 6 weeks ahead of plant transplant. They're a little slower to develop out than broccoli. Still a big plant, allowing 24-inch between plants. and still hungry and thirsty, so water consistently during that summer cycle and feed them well at planting and again at about 4 to 6 weeks into the growing cycle. Normally they will ripen more or less, the sprouts that you're harvesting will ripen more or less from the bottom up. So you'll see them getting largest on the bottom first, harvest them out and slowly work your way up. It's okay to just pick off selected ready sprouts and leave the rest to continue ripening.
Is that what it actually looks like?
If you shear all the leaves off, that's
Right.
fairly typical, yeah, right at harvest. Normally by the time there's this far, I've harvested about a third of that stem by now, and you've just got bare stem and then. Yeah, but yes, basically. That's really ideal because a lot of times they're like bent over or leaning in the garden like this if you're not, especially if you don't do a good job of staking them. The root systems are not that big and the plants are pretty top heavy as they mature out. Really, you plant them early. A lot of people do plant them April, May for summer to fall harvest, but they taste pretty cabbagey to me in the summer harvest. They're better after you've had a couple of frosts. October, November is really peak season as far as I'm concerned for Brussels. They are subject to root maggots on the early end. Caterpillars, so the various cabbage loopers and their cousins, and beetles are severely damaging to them. Aphids are a huge problem. Aphids are on the leaves and on the growing tip, but aphids are down in the creases of all those sprouts if you're not right on top of controlling them very early. So you keep on top of your aphid control. One of the things about ground storing them though, is that I found that yes, the aphids are really bad on your fall harvest if you're not on top of it, but sometimes if you left some stuff in because they were just too aphidy to bother, you'll see a serious decline in aphids as you get later and later into the winter. And you might actually clean them up enough to bother harvesting, although often the quality suffers a bit after that much aphid damage. Slugs are a chronic problem on them up on into the sprouts, so watch for slug damage. Cabbage, great for a greens crop, great for fermenting. Cabbages are a huge food resource. They typically hold fairly well after picking compared to other head coals. The yields, a single cabbage head can be anywhere from 2 to 3 to maybe 4 or 5 pounds of cabbage per head. So the productivity is phenomenal. If you plant different varieties all at the same time, they harvest at different periods of time. So you can have a range of succession of harvest. A typical pattern for fall and winter cabbage is to do your transplanting in around 4th of July-ish or a little after. You can go as late as early August. And if you're starting your own seed, which is the only way you're going to get much variety to plant all at once, unless you're planting a huge volume, start your seed about 5 weeks ahead of planned transplant. So that's the issue for me for cabbage is that if you buy 6 packs of cabbage, how much cabbage you're going to eat, right? And if you're fermenting, it's one thing, but how much you're going to eat? So you buy a 6-pack of cabbage, it's always like one type of cabbage, or it's always like 2 or 3 types that are just mixed and you don't even know what's in it. So if you really want to intentionally time your fall harvests, your winter harvest, your overwinter harvest, you pretty much have to get 3 or 4 different seed packages and start your own transplants for transplanting out for that variety. Typically, cabbage holds up really well in the winter post-maturation. Now, if you're growing cabbage as a spring for summer harvest crop, you know that's not the case in the summer. When they're ready, and they start actually declining or bolting even if you leave them in the ground too long. But November and later harvests of cabbage actually hold up pretty well in the garden, subject to insect and slug damage, of course, and can be left to use as you need with reasonable quality still. Typically fall harvest varieties, and if you get really technical on some of these catalogs from seed companies, they'll say, assuming you're planting at this time, this is a November variety, or this is a January variety, so kind of targeted for fairly specific periods. But generally speaking, fall harvest, we would consider anything before Thanksgiving. Late November through Christmas or even New Year's would be winter harvest, and February through maybe early March is overwinter typically. Root maggots still a problem, aphids still a problem. Slugs a surprisingly difficult problem in cabbage. They get all the way down inside there, and they're very difficult to get out at harvest. All season control for those. Cauliflower, I love cauliflower. I have more success with it as an early spring for summer harvest than I do as a overwintered or winter crop. Easy enough to do fall harvest. Plant it in July as transplants. You'll harvest it in October if you're using fall harvest maturation varieties. If you're doing your own from seed, again, it's about 5 weeks from seed to transplant. They're really subject to cold damage, wet damage, and my garden is sometimes briefly underwater. I'm on a very wet soil, so it does make some of these fall and winter, or these winter and overwintered coles a little more challenging. Definitely need cover. Now, if you're harvesting November, we are not going to be cold enough to likely damage. One year I lost my fall call with a late October hard 18-degree frost, but that happens so rarely. Mostly they won't need it. But winter harvest and overwintered cauliflower definitely will. We always get cold enough to damage them over the winter here. Fertilize well, water consistently. Typical cole crop, beetles, aphids, caterpillars, and root maggots are what you're watching out for. Slugs are a surprisingly intense problem late in the growing cycle on cauliflower, where they actually get up into the crown and start stripping out parts of the curd that you want to eat in these funny little trails. So watch for slugs even in the late part of the season. And kohlrabi. So kohlrabi I have kind of a love-hate thing with because it's really an easy cole to grow, but I don't eat that much of it. The only way I really eat cole is sliced fresh. You know, just peel it and slice it fresh. And it's got this really rich kind of cabbagey flavor. It's got a little more bite than cabbage, but still kind of sweetish. Considering doing more, I've been kind of doing a little bit of research about fermenting, and apparently it ferments really well, and that'd be a good fermenting crop to play with. So it's a stem crop. It looks like it would be a root crop, but it's not. The actual root system is just a tapered root, and the leaves are above that. But what you're harvesting is this swollen chunk of stem that the leaves are coming off from. So it's a stem crop technique, kind of an unusual thing. But mostly we treat them as if they were a cole crop, or as if they were a leaf crop, root crop for that purpose. So transplants, kohlrabi can be grown almost year round here. You can plant spring for summer harvest, early summer for late summer to fall harvest. July, August is planted for fall to winter harvest, as late as early September for later fall and into winter harvest. They do take a little while to grow from seed. They are direct seedable. My dad does a lot of that with them. In my opinion, I would rather start them as transplants and transplant them out rather than thin them after seeding, because you have to seed pretty dense. The failure rate on brassicas from direct sowing is pretty high. So figure 6 weeks ahead of transplant normally. Denser plantings than most of the coles. This is something you'd be putting at maybe 9 to 12 inches apart and still getting good harvests. Hungry like all the coles, and very little capacity to find water, so water them consistently, especially the summer plantings. Harvest is literally just you harvest the whole stem piece, and that's what you eat. So it is a destructive harvest. You get the whole plant out. Slugs are a bit of a problem. Aphids are a significant problem. Root maggots, especially for these later plantings, are a problem. Caterpillars and beetles, frequent problems for them. Problem with cole crops is bugs. All right, legumes. Fava beans, usually grown over the winter for late spring harvest. We can lose them when it gets really cold or when the weather gets really inclement. You can direct sow dense, and if you like small seeded hot favas, you might actually sow them a lot denser than this. But for typical large seeded like aquadulces, plant individual seeds like about 5 inches apart, or you can plant them denser or thin, but you need that kind of space. They're a fairly stocky, upright, and large plant. October plantings, or maybe early October, late September plantings, are May to June harvest. They're a legume, so they're nitrogen fixing. They don't need tons of fertilizer, but if you're going to really maximize your yield, feed them decently at planting and give them a little bit of a follow-up feed in the spring to get them going along well. Not super thirsty, but not super drought tolerant either. Typically you want to pick them before the shucks split, but when they're nice and full and plump and swollen. Typically these later plantings, these October plantings, have really few insect or pest problems. If you push the front end of the season with August, September, you have to fight a little bit more on the bug issues. Slugs are always something of a problem. Mostly with favas, I don't have much pea weevil problem myself. Now, that's not to say it couldn't be a problem. All these legumes grow pretty slow as an overwintered crop, and the pea weevils are active year round. And so when their pea weevils are feeding faster than the legumes are growing, that's when you start having problems. Overwintered peas, not super reliable, fun to play with, quick maturing varieties, short and stocky varieties. Typical pea planting, if you plant in July for fall or in September for overwintered, plant them about an inch apart. These are bush peas, you don't really even have to thin them past that. And despite being a legume, they really do benefit from a bit more fertilization than some of the other legumes. So give them a good dose of fertilizer right at planting. Your fall plantings may not need much water, just a little bit to get going. Your summer plantings definitely do. And summer plantings for fall harvest do benefit from being in the shade of taller plants. Don't overheat them. Aphids and leafhoppers are significant problems on peas and often spread viral diseases. This decreases as we get later into the season. Pea weevils on overwintered peas are a serious problem. I have this problem also with winter started peas for spring harvest. The peas just don't grow fast enough, and on many legumes you'll see the pea weevils just doing some leaf notching or minor feeding, but on young pea starts they actually top them. And you might get away if the pea is far enough developed with one topping, but if they get topped again they just stunt out and they don't even flower or seed well. Covers are not needed for temperature protection. This is a crop you can direct sow seed in the ground in January in Western Oregon. But the inclement weather is hard enough on them that I often will put little frames over them and some remade just to protect them from the storms more than anything else. Root crops, beets, highly reliable crop if you follow the basic directions. Really flexible timing. You can plant them varying times through the year, even a succession of plantings, and have beets through the year. Spring sown beets for summer harvest taste like dirt. Summer planted beets for fall and later harvest are sweet. So well worth learning to do that as an ancillary crop instead of a main season crop. They are a chenopod. They do get leaf miners, just like spinach and chard. They're very closely related to spinach and chard. And you can seed them anytime. We start sowing beets as early as April for your summer harvest. For fall harvest, you might start sowing as early as right now, mid-June. And sow small blocks all the way through the end of August or first part of September. Harvest will be fall to winter. One of the key notes on beets that makes them weird. So most seeds, you plant a seed. That seed is one seed. It grows a plant. Beet seed is not a seed, it's a dried fruit, a drupe. There are several seeds inside that seed. If you plant them and then you don't thin them, you have clusters that never do anything because they crowd each other out. It is very, very important to thin aggressively to about a 5 or 6 inch spacing for good productivity. You can leaf harvest beets. Many people grow beets as a greens crop. If you are growing for both greens and beets, you need to leaf harvest very lightly, only 2 or 3 leaves per plant. So you would need a lot of them to get much. But well worth considering for kind of broadening out your diet a little bit. Yes.
The little clusters that come up that you need thin, they transplant?
Okay, so
Well,
beets can be transplanted, and we sometimes offer them in cell packs, or you can start your own. They tap very fast.
Yeah.
So you have to be really quick about it. Yes, you can salvage and transplant them if you have the space and the wherewithal. Time versus dollars. I would spend another $3 on another package of beets and just seed more and then just thin. Because it is a chore to carefully dig and successfully transplant baby beets. But yes, it is nominally doable. So harvest a few at a time as needed. They will ground store fairly well into the winter, not forever. They, like a lot of the root crops, they actually hold up pretty well post-harvest in refrigeration. So you do have that option. Like I can't ground store beets, my soils are too wet every place I'm growing them. So I'll just harvest them all out in late October, early November, and I'll get them all nice and clean and washed up and top them and get them dry. And throw them in the vegetable compartment. They're still good in March from an October, November harvest. They're just fine. So in reasonably humid refrigeration, beets and carrots will hold for months. So don't be panicked about leaving them in the ground if you're fighting it too much. Moderate nutrition, moderate to minimal watering. Later plantings will only need until the rains come in, and they're reasonably drought tolerant in the early growing cycle compared to a lot of other crops. They tap really quick. However, when those beets actually start swelling, you do need to make sure that they're not drying out, or they won't size right and they'll actually get tough in the middle. So usually we say beet crops being a 45, 50, 60-day crop, we usually say somewhere about midpoint in that growing cycle. It's a good idea. So about third week in, to up your watering to consistent if you're not already getting enough rain, or they won't size well. Leaf miners are the big problem. Aphids are an occasional problem. A number of soil-dwelling insects are really hard on beets if you leave them in the ground. So if you're having wireworm problems, for example, or some phylum problems, they're not going to hold for you. Rodents eat beets, so another thing you need to be watching for a little bit. Carrots, high yield crop per space invested. You can give yourself 6 square feet of carrots and get lots and lots of carrots out of 6 square feet. So very slow germination, which is a bit of a challenge, more so in the fall and the summer planting for fall and winter gardening than it is for stuff you're planting in April when it's raining all the time. Takes 21 plus days for germination for most carrot varieties. So you need to make sure they don't ever really get dried out. But unlike other seeds, you can't just mulch them to keep water in. If you put something on top of them that cakes, they just bend over when they're trying to germinate and they don't develop well. So seed them on the soil surface. I lightly cover with a non-caking soil, like a sandy loam. I've occasionally used potting soils that have wetting agents added, something that doesn't shrink up to a dry water repellent hard surface. Don't give up. I'm notorious for going through at about day 20 reseeding because nothing's up, and then 3 days later realize that the stuff I planted in the first place is coming up. Consider interplanting your carrots to avoid this problem. Put your carrots down, prep your bed, put your carrots down, and then throw some radish seeds right on top of them. Radish seeds come up very, very fast. And radish seeds will be harvesting about the time your carrots are just getting sprouted and established, thus automatically thinning your carrot patch. Typically we sow dense because there's a fair amount of failure rate, and we thin to a 1 or 2 inch spacing. I normally go for a 2 inch spacing between sprouts to allow decent size for the carrots to develop. If you do the math, you realize what your pounds can be. I mean, you get 2 pounds of carrots per row foot easy. And so very, very high yielding crop. They really don't like rich composty soils. They like sandy soils. It's okay to have some compost incorporated in if you're in clay soil to make your soil workable enough for carrots to grow, but you must use well-aged compost, nothing that is still potentially decomposing. This causes your carrots to fork, get hairy, and otherwise have problems. Similarly, they don't like a lot of nitrogen. I normally do give them a very light dose of granular vegetable food at planting, but only a light dose because too much nitrogen will also affect the carrot adversely. Water moderate, especially on these summer plantings. Got to keep it evenly moist during germination. Once they've actually sprouted, you can back down quite considerably. You can dry garden carrots as a spring to summer crop. That's not really practical for summer plantings, of course, but surprisingly drought tolerant. They don't really need a lot of water. They ground store better than beets on average. My typical pattern is to leave the carrots in the ground, just picking a few at a time as I need them. Usually like late January, early February, I'll pull them because I'm worried about the quality declining as they start wanting to try to grow again in February and March. The later you harvest them, typically the higher the sugar content. So they can be a real surprise when you pick them in January and realize just how sweet carrots can be. Gophers and other rodents are a serious pest in carrots. Slugs actually hit the tops of the carrots pretty badly. Number of soil insects that give you problems. Like crucifers have a root maggot, the cabbage root maggot. Members of the parsley family have a carrot rust fly maggot. This is really relevant for plantings in July and August. So when the first seedlings are first sprouting, the rust fly lays its eggs on the soil right at the stem, or actually touching the stem. And as that seedling develops, that maggot burrows down into the developing carrot. So from the moment you're seeing germination until the plants are between 4 and 6 inches tall, so it's usually about 3 weeks post germination, put an insect barrier over them for these summer plantings. It's really hard to otherwise avoid this problem. Garlic, one of the easiest overwinter crops, great introductory crop. Like onions, they're regulated by day length rather than how long they've been in the ground. Hardneck garlic stores moderately, several months. Soft-neck garlic stores a year, under good conditions, 8 to 10 months in any case, if properly cured and dried. In Western Oregon, garlic does not need winter protection. It is perfectly hardy. I've never frozen any out. Plant your garlic bulbs deeper than you think, 3 inches deep or so, 4 to 6 inches apart, September or October. Nominally, you could plant in December, February, March, if you can still find garlic bulbs to plant. But the later you get, the smaller your yield is going to be. So the sooner you get them in the ground, the better. They have a very long growing period. Harvest is after your main garden season, usually early July for most varieties. So it does occupy that space, meaning that after your garlic comes out, you're not planting tomatoes, but you might be planting a new fall and winter crop in that space for the fall and fall winter. They are really, really hungry. You wouldn't think from looking at the leaves, but the whole onion family really love nitrogen. Feed them extremely well. So for me, that means I'm feeding them a granular fertilizer at planting. I'm liquid feeding in October or November. I'm liquid feeding again in February, and I'm putting another dose of granular fertilizer on in March. This gives me big, robust garlic yields. You can feed them at planting and ignore them, and as long as you don't let the weeds overcrowd them, then you will have garlic. It's a question of how big, how much garlic. So the fertilizing is all about yield rather than about success or failure. Harvest them. Cool parts of the day when they're ready. Watch the progression. They will go yellow leaves from the bottom, working their way up. They're doing that now if you're looking at your garden now. When you got 2 or 3 green leaves on top and the rest of it's fairly yellow, go ahead and dig. It's best to stop watering in the spring 2 to 3 weeks before planting, before harvest. Now, that might be an issue this year with the rainstorms. If you don't, all that paper around the cloves is going to just rot away. And then you don't have the storage capability out of that garlic. It's still usable garlic, but it's not going to hold. Get them out of the ground. Don't wash them. Don't try to clean them. Just get them spread out and drying in a dark, warm place. I use my garage. Initially, I'll usually throw them in 5-gallon buckets standing upright in the garage, and then I'll come back in a week and I'll spread them out on sheets of cardboard in the garage. And usually about 2 to 3 weeks after harvest, they're cured enough to go ahead and cut the roots, cut the stems, or braid the stems if that's what you're into, and then put them in longer term storage in buckets or bins in the garage. Not a lot of problems. There are some, they have a maggot too, onion maggots, hit and miss problem here. It's a few disease issues. Thrips are kind of a significant problem on both garlic and onions and worth paying attention to start seeing thrips as lesions or almost a stippled, like a sandblasted, like mite feeding damage. It's a sandblasted look to the leaves. Thrips can be a significant pest in terms of yield. They're not going to kill the plant and are treatable just like aphids. They're very similar to aphids in many regards. Leeks take a long time to grow, but are in most regards easier than onions because there's less potential things that can go wrong with them. If you plant your transplants about 6 inches apart in June, we're actually almost past now for fall harvest, but all the way into early August for winter to spring harvest, and they do overwinter quite well. You can direct sow leeks. A lot of people do. Very common for people to also start them in seedlings and then transplant them out. Seed to transplantable size is about 8 weeks. Onion family takes a while to be ready to transplant, so kind of think ahead if you're looking at setting your own transplants. Transplants are readily, seedling transplants are readily available in the nurseries, so it might be worth your time to just buy them. There's not tons and tons of varietal variation in leeks, but there are some, and if you have some specific tastes or preferences, you may have to do your own from seed. They're relatively shallow and small rooted, so fertilize well, water really consistently until the fall winds take over. Like all this onion garlic family, not a huge amount of pest problems. Occasional aphids, thrips are definitely worth watching for. Leeks do not store as well as onions or garlic, so don't overplant. But on the other flip side, they have a unique and more subtle flavor than either of the above. Onions. So onions are, again, determined by day length, which means we cannot grow short day onions here. That is something you do south of the Mason-Dixon line, southern onions. We do long day onions here, or in a few cases, day neutral or intermediate day. They're not truly day neutral, they're intermediate day onions. Of course, if you're growing bunching onions for scallions, or you're growing onions for greens, you can throw a lot of these rules out because you're not actually trying to set a good, robust bulb. Typical pattern is to start seed in June, July for transplanting in August and September. This is for things like Walla Walla sweets, which do not set a storage bulb that you pretty much have to do as an overwinter plant that way. Storage onions are often available as hard sets. They're bulbs that have gone through a single growing cycle. They've gone dormant, they've been harvested out. Now you can plant them in the fall for harvest as finished onions, June, July. Walla Walla sweets and other sweet type onions cannot be grown that way. So you either do the seed or transplant seedlings, or in February, a lot of the nurseries will have bunches. So somebody who commercially has gone out and started hundreds and thousands of these onions from seed, grown them up to that finish point, stocked them, harvested them, and sold them to the nurseries in these collections. You buy 60 or 70 plants in a bunch, sometimes a little bit more. And you plant them out right then in February, and you have excellent onions in June, July. It's the most successful way to do sweet onions unless you are really good about doing your own from seed. And doing onions from seed from direct seeding is difficult because such a long germination period and such a moisture needing. They do not tolerate getting dried out during their germination at all. Whatever you're doing from a transplant standpoint, or you can direct or thin your direct sown, but you need to be 4 or 5 inches apart for a good finish. I've got a 4x4 bed right now that's just about ready to harvest onions. That's 50 onion plants in a 4-foot-by-4-foot bed. So that'll keep me going for a while. Walla Walla sweets, be judicious about how much you plant unless you have a ready resource for getting rid of them. Walla Walla sweets and similar sweet types do not store very well. Storage onions do. There's several good types to play with. The sets you'll only find 2 or 3 varieties available from. If you like to have different storage onions like copras, you're going to do your own from seed, or you're going to buy bunches when they're available. Onions will start pushing up as they mature. Do not bury them. If you mulch or bury completely over the top of that bulb, but in contact with the stem, you're going to get a stem rot that's going to go down through the core of that onion and will ruin your storage capability and may ruin the whole onion. So be very careful about stem contact. So garlic we plant and we mulch. Onions we plant and we lightly mulch when they're first growing up. And then we don't typically mulch after, just let them go ahead and push up. They're hungry plants, consistent fertilization, good watering, again, the thrips. Garlic flowers, right? Sometimes you get a flower spike, no big deal. You can eat it, you can cut it off, you can let it be, you still get garlic, no problems. Onions that are stressed for any of a number of reasons, like inconsistent watering, or too much nitrogen and then none, or too little nitrogen and then a sudden feeding, or weather variabilities, a lot of factors here, will try to flower. Because that's their goal. That's why they're a biennial crop with an overwinter cycle and flower, right? Flowering on onion is a disaster, basically. and it's the end of the growing cycle. If you see flowers starting on your onions, get them out of the ground at whatever stage they're at, get them dried, cured, finished off, consume them relatively quickly. Because it's not going to get any better in the bulb and it's not going to store. I have a ton of problem with bolting from sets, just because of so many variables that happen over the winter in my garden. I have no problem with bunches. I got one plant that bolted out of 50 something. I had about 30% of my sets. So just goes with the territory. But sets are cheap and timely, good timing for most people to handle. Parsnips take forever to grow, but also ground store incredibly well. One of the few crops I would actually recommend you just leave in the ground and pick in January. Not a lot of crops you can do that with. If you are direct sowing them, which is really about the only way to handle them because they tap root almost immediately and they're very hard to transplant. You're doing this direct sowing the seed in the ground right now for winter harvest. June to early July at the very latest for winter harvest. A slow and erratic germination like carrots, but worse. Like carrots, they get the carrot rust fly maggots. So you need to cover them once you see germination until they're big enough that the flies leave them alone. They're not hungry, they're not thirsty, and so there's some definite benefits to working with them. I would grow more of them if I had better culinary uses for them. Parsnips roasted is about all you're going to do with them, really, for most people. Soups and stews, yes, I've heard that as well. Slugs can be an issue. They do, like with carrots, they'll shoulder up a bit, and you'll get slugs sometimes at the top of the root you want to eat. Harvest just a few at a time. Leave them in the ground nearly forever. They hold up extremely well in the ground in most situations. Radishes. This is your champion quick turnaround crops, 25 to 35 days from seed to harvest. For many varieties, daikons take longer. Some of the elongate types take longer. There are definitely exceptions, but there's a lot of them in that time frame. How much radish you're going to eat all at once? It doesn't store worth a darn, so definitely lots of small batches frequently rather than a whole big batch all at once. So seed sown now is still a summer harvest. Seed sown in July and August is usually a fall harvest. Seed sown through September and into potentially as late as early October will give you winter harvest, but radishes are only hardy in the teens somewhere. So if you're going to go for that late winter harvest, do throw covers over them. Seed them dense and then thin down to adequate spacing. They are very picky about getting adequate nutrients early, not such a big problem late in the season, and about not drying out. They get hot and tough if they get too dry. So definitely keep the water consistent for all these summer plantings.
Hot, you mean spicy?
Spicy, burning, yeah, yeah, or slightly bitterly hot in some cases, yes. You typically seed dense, you'll seed to about 2 to 3 inches apart, and watch for beetles. Radishes are infamous for the flea beetle populations, but also cucumber beetles and other leaf-feeding beetles. Aphids are a hit and miss problem for me on radishes, and slugs are a significant problem on radishes. Rutabaga. Okay, so next couple, rutabagas and turnips, right? Very similar plants. Rutabagas are better storing and larger than turnips, but are otherwise kind of similar. They're kind of a staple for me in the winter garden. They can be transplanted if you do them at just the right stage. They can also be direct sown. That's pretty common. Normally sow late June to early July, or start your plantings about 6 weeks ahead for transplant. Harvest November, December, or January, pretty typically. Past solstice, I wouldn't try to hold, but up to that point, they will normally hold. Like they're a crucifer. They're a broccoli cauliflower family plant. A lot of our root crops are. So definitely, like most of those, they're hungry, they're thirsty. Keep on your watering game in the summer and feed them really well at planting. Biggest problem with holding them in the winter is how wet does your soil get? I have to be selective about where I plant my rutabagas for over winter. So much of my garden is so very, very wet. Like with all the crucifer crops, aphids are a surprising problem for most root crops in the crucifers. I don't have that much of an aphid problem. Rutabagas and turnips get hammered by aphids, and beetles everywhere on them in the summer. So pay close attention for those pests early. Turnips you need to get out early. We'll talk about them in a minute. Rutabagas actually are fine at 6 or even 7 inches. So it's okay to let them size up in the ground over the winter, where turnips, once they get beyond 3 to 4 inches, start getting tougher and tougher. Don't panic with the rutabagas, they hold it. Shallots, so onion garlic family again. More nuanced flavors than either garlic or onion. They're kind of a pleasant culinary specialty. They're a pain to grow. That's why they're so expensive. Plant shallots shallow. It's an easy mnemonic, which means typically I'm planting the bulbs with maybe just a little bit of tip of the bulb showing and then putting 2 inches of mulch over the top. Because if you bury them 3 inches like you do onion sets or garlic, they won't come up. September, October bulb planting. Theoretically, there's ways you can do this from seed in the spring as well. Most people just do them from bulbs. It's definitely the way to do it. And again, like with most of these crops, you theoretically could do it as late as March with, yes, harvest, but substantially reduced yields. They are hungry plants. They're thirsty plants, especially as we get late into the season. Usually with your September, October plantings, like with garlic, you may need to water them once, maybe twice, and then the rains take over. But as they develop up in the spring, they're relatively intolerant of getting dried out compared to garlic. Onions are kind of similar in that regard. Shallow, small root systems that don't hold water well. Onions and garlic, we like to withhold water before harvest, a couple of weeks. Shallots, you certainly can do that. It's much less important. You typically don't have to worry as much about the levels of paper and rot because they're clear up on top of the soil surface. They're not as likely to rot. And so you plant one shallot bulb, and what you get is a cluster of shallot bulbs. Thrips are a problem. Other than that, we don't have a lot of major insect or disease problems. Diseases on allium family are controlled by rotation. So the problems are things that are going to be residual in the soil, not new airborne diseases coming in frequently. So it's really important that you space your interval, your crops, so you're not putting alliums in the garden and then alliums the next year in the same spot. Very critical. It's also very, very important on the crucifer group. And turnips, very similar to your rutabagas, but smaller and typically maturing both quicker and not holding quite as well. So densely, direct sow is the way to go for turnips. Transplanting is a pain. Thinning to about 5 or 6 inch spacing. October, November harvest for Thanksgiving are great. Getting into December, we start worrying a little bit about quality issues on turnips. Also sizing, because they don't really completely stop growing. If you're getting up there around 3 or 4 inches, get them out of the ground, get them clean, get them stored in the refrigerator. They'll hold reasonably well refrigerated. Once they get beyond about 4 inches, the quality declines pretty substantially. So still a crucifer crop, all the same problems in that family with needing fertilizer, more drought tolerant than a lot, and insect pests. Beetles, aphids are significant pests on turnips. Okay, so we've gone through the crops, some details on the crops. Let's talk a little bit about how we make this happen. And the first thing is planning the crop rotations. You have to have the space in the garden in June to July, or maybe August at the latest, for these crops to work. So this means you either left things unplanted, which I'm notoriously bad at doing, or you're following early maturing crops with these later crops for fall and winter harvest. So examples: overwintered kale, overwintered chard. That space comes available roughly in April. You can main season garden it, or you can leave it for fall plantings. Overwintered garlic, overwintered onions, finishing up in June and July. Perfect timing for fall and winter crops. But you don't want to plant another crop of alliums behind them, right? A lot of early planted cauliflower will be ripening in June to July. And sometimes cabbage as well. You have that space, but You don't want to follow that up with anything in the crucifer family, so in this spot for non-cruciferous plants. Peas. Your peas normally peter out sometime in July. Gets hot, they get virusy. That's some space that's available now for some fall and winter plants. So plan ahead the space or take advantage of the space as it occurs, but you got to think it through ahead of the game. It's not going to happen if you don't plan for it. We're going to talk in just a minute here about the families again, because we talked a little bit about it variety by variety, about where they all fit together, so you know where they fit into the game. Important to feed well at planting. Soils have been depleted. Important to do a good job of soil amending, even if you just had a crop in there. Remember, you've been watering, you've been feeding, you've grown a crop, you've taken it out, you've stripped nutrients, you've changed the soil consistency. So we're getting ready to plant a new fall and winter crop. Take the time to do a good job of compost amending as necessary, fertilizing and watering. The watering is tougher than you think in July and August, because you're onto a regular pattern for your established garden, sure. But your newly seeded, newly transplanted things might need 2 or 3 times a day if we're 105 degrees. So you're going to need to do some hand watering in addition to whatever you're doing for timers or whatever for the rest of the garden as a whole. So just don't forget that, don't neglect that step. Summer plantings are at peak of insect population, but one of the lower points typically in slug population, again, depending on your watering and other growing considerations. But the slug problems pick up as the fall and winter progress, where the insect problems slowly decline. So typically these earlier crops, we're really watching the insect problems. Things that are being planted in June and July, definitely an issue. By the time we get to the end of August and into September and those later planted crops, the insect pressures diminish pretty substantially, but slugs become increasingly a problem. And for standing crops in particular, the slugs build up. Aphids are the one insect problem that don't really decline much. August, aphids are still going nuts. September, the aphids are still going nuts. But as the day length changes and as the nights start getting cooler, mid to late September, they do actually decline, but they never go away like a lot of the beetles and all the caterpillars do. So bear that in mind. Aphids are kind of an exception. Biggest problem people have with their fall and winter garden is trying to do it in August and September. Most of it needs to be happening in June or July. That's why we have this class now. Timing is critical, and following the patterns for growth are important. Like so many of our crop plants, a whole batch of our weeds in Western Oregon think that the rainfall of fall is the beginning of the growing season. They grow, they're adapted to a dry summer climate. They go dormant at night in the summer unless you're irrigating, and then they start up massively again as the rains come in. So it's very important you keep those weeds under control in the cultivated winter garden. These winter crop plants are growing, but they're growing slowly, and they're very intolerant of that competition for nutrients in particular. So a couple of times a winter, go out there and clean out the rows and areas where you actually have crops growing. Make sure that they're not being encroached upon. That was my first mistake, my first few winter gardens, is not paying enough attention to the weed population. And then some crops definitely need or at least benefit from protection. And often the amount of protection needed is not very great. Just a few degrees is enough to make the difference between dormant and slowly growing, or between crown survival and crown death on overwintered plants. Crop families, crucifers. So all the coles, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kohlrabi, kale, leaf crops, kale, mustards, arugulas, collards, and root crops, radishes, rutabagas, and turnips. These are all crucifers. They have the same disease and pest issues. So you need to space your plantings over time. So you're not planting a crucifer and following it with another crucifer. I would love to see a situation where you have enough space and wherewithal that you can go 2 to 3 years in rotation. That's not practical for most home gardeners. I want you to get used to alternate yearing at minimum. So a year it has a crucifer crop in it, that soil space has no crucifer crop for at least 1 full year after, okay? What does that really mean? Well, it's the area where the root plant is growing, where the roots of that plant are growing, or where you've had crop debris from that plant falling. So you can move over 4 feet and be in a completely different soil profile in terms of rotation. By home garden standards, we're talking agriculturally, it would be a whole different game. It does matter how monocrop and uniform you do this. If you consistently plant 10-foot rows of everything, you have a fairly substantial area that's being impacted. If you scatter your poles randomly throughout the garden, which is what I do, often that's not such a big issue because you just don't have that whole monoculture disease buildup situation where you have all the same crops in the same area. The allium family are your onions, your shallots, your garlic. There's some herbs in that family, for example, chives. They have serious disease problems that if you get them into your soil may prohibit you from growing any alliums in that soil for 10 years or more. This is why we rotate them. You could get, like with potato famine in Ireland, right? Okay, they grew potatoes exclusively on these fields forever and ever and ever. Worked until suddenly it didn't, right? Same thing with onions and garlic. You might be able to grow garlic in that same spot of soil for 5 years, and then year 6, you develop white mold sclerotinia, and now you're stuck with no alliums for 10 years. So be respectful of this issue, and understand that just because you got away with it doesn't mean you should be getting away with it. Caprifoli's, nothing in that group in the vegetable garden except the corn salad. This is your honeysuckle family, but the only thing you're likely to see is a batch of bushes in that family for us out here. The chenopod's, there's some minor ones out there too, but the big ones you're going to see are beets, spinach, and chard. These are all surprisingly adaptable plants, but they do have some buildup of disease issues that can happen. I worry less about chenopod rotation than I do about crucifers or alliums. Legumes build up both disease pest problems and insect pest problems, particularly weevils. So well worth rotating. They do recommend a 4-year commercially, but you're not going to do that in your home gardens usually. Peas and fabas, and in the summer garden, of course, every type of bean. Worth mentioning that a lot of your cover crops are legumes. A lot of your cover crops can contribute to some of these problems. So clover and vetch, cover crop, fabas, Austrian field peas, those are still legumes. What that means for me in my garden is areas I'm planning on planting a pea or a bean crop in the summer, I don't cover crop with legumes just to avoid that issue. I'll just stick it with grains for a cover crop. Parsley family, carrots and parsnip, of course, lots of herbs, dill, coriander, parsley are also parsley family. Some disease pressures that can occur, insect pressures would be a bigger concern. Again, parsley family I worry less about than I do about crucifers and aphids. Okay, covers. So there's a lot more insect activity, as we mentioned. You can use covers for frost blankets, but you can also use covers to exclude insects. Timing does matter for that. And keep in mind, these covers do impact water flow through and some degree light coming through. Yes, they're porous, they let some water through. Yes, they let light through, but they're not perfect about it. So we don't want to cover newly seeded areas on crops that require light for germination, because it will dramatically slow or eliminate the possibility of that seed germinating. But once the seeds are up, we can resume using them. This is worth doing for the cabbage root maggot control and carrot rust fly maggot control on those crops for summer plantings. Also for leaf miners. Leaf miners are a pain to control. We'll talk about that in a minute. Covers are also used for temperature protection for crops that you're going to be continuing to harvest, where you need that extra 4 or 5 degrees to make sure they're still growing, or for protecting of less than hardened crops. So covers might look something like this. This is my garden out here on the left with a very young crop of peas that overwintering underneath that tunnel cover. So typical covers would be things like ream-made blanket or fleece. They call it fleece. It's not a fleece. It's still a synthetic material spun. Depending on the manufacturer and the make, those things give you 2 or 3, maybe 4 degrees of temperature improvement. And it's slightly different how much insulative value they give you in the nighttime versus how much they're increasing the interior growing temperatures in the daytime. So it's typically you're getting 2 or 3 degrees of frost protection, but maybe 4 or 5 degrees of incremental increase inside them for the growing part of the day. You can put hoops or other structures and drape them over and anchor them down, or hoops driven into the ground like you see there. On more robust plants like broccoli and cauliflower, you can loose, drape them right on top of the plant. They can be in direct contact with the plants. The caveat to that for winter gardening is that if we have 4 inches of snow and you've got a cover over your row and it's not anchored to anything, it's sitting right on the plants, it's just more weight load pushing down on those plants, potentially breaking them or otherwise deforming. So pay attention to your weather forecasts if you're using covers. Clear plastic should never be in contact with any part of the plants. This goes for both hard and soft plastics, because you'll actually create burns where that contact happens. So you need to create, or either buy something that has structure or create some kind of structure to put those on. They typically give more insulative value, 3 or 4 up to 5 or 6 degrees, depending on the plastic used, and also 5 to 6 degrees of interior heating up, and sometimes more on a sunny day. They're more volatile in how much temperature you're generating inside. If you're using hard frames, it's a good idea to get ones that have built-in vents, especially for the end of the season. When we're getting into March and you get a 3 or 4 sunny days and it's 105 in there, it can be a real problem. A lot of these plants really don't like it once we're getting up into those 80s after overwintered. If you're doing soft films, pay attention to your forecast and vent as needed, depending on what's happening in your actual weather. Hard films do not allow water through. Take that into account late in the season as we begin drying out. Some years it doesn't matter. Some years, you know, we're out here in the nursery, we're watering containers in April some years, and if you still got crops under plastic, they're going to desperately need additional water. It's not getting through just by sprinkling. Okay, yes.
Quickly, you said not to cover seeds because
Right.
they might need light to germinate.
Yes.
Aren't seeds around anyway?
No, actually, a lot of them are carrots, for example, parsnips are sown maybe a 1/4 inch deep. Anything that's listed for like a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch of seed depth is considered surface seeding and requires light for germination. Grass seed's another good example. On the other hand, seeds like beans, peas, corn that are planted 1 to 2 inches down are not light sensitive. Squash is not light sensitive. As long as they're in soil contact and the temperatures are adequate, they germinate. So yeah, some seeds are light requiring, and typically it's lettuce is another one that's light requiring. You got to have light.
Lettuce and carrots would probably be the two.
Yeah, lettuce, carrots, parsnips would be your winter crops if that's going to be particularly relevant too. Yeah. So some pests, root maggots, a couple of types, carrot rust fly maggot. There's also an onion and garlic maggot and the cabbage root maggots. Once you have them in your plants, you really can't do anything about it for those plants. If you've got a very minor infestation of cabbage root maggot, you might be able to baby those plants along and still get a yield, but I wouldn't count on it. Normally our response is, if you are seeing cabbage root maggots, you are culling the plants that are affected and you're immediately covering to make sure that they're not still spreading. Cabbage root maggots are laid when the plants are very small, so if you cover them, you can prevent that a lot. Your symptom is you'll have young seedlings or transplants up, and you know we're wet, or you're watering, or you're feeding, and all of a sudden they start just drooping. Despite good care, they're just failing. Well, sure, it could be shock, but usually shock will show other symptoms besides just a wilt. Top wilting down, you get down there, you pull up the plant, you got all these little comma-shaped maggots down there in the root system. So best is prevention. If you have any history of root maggot problems, or if you're concerned about that, it's going to be a very devastating to you if you lose a crop. Make sure you're covering when they're young. So basically 4 inches high on carrots and parsnips is past the damage threshold for carrot rust fly maggot. 6 inches high for brassicas is past the damage threshold for cabbage root maggot. In a pinch, when I was just frustrated about losing almost an entire crop of cauliflower to cabbage root maggot, I culled the worst plants and I drenched the soil with neem on all the other plants. Whether that was the success rate or not, because I obviously didn't pull those plants to check for root fly maggots, I did not have any root fly maggots in the rest of those plants, and I did finish those crops, although I had to cull the ones that were affected. So that is in a pinch, might get you by if you're right on the bubble. Beetles are really a problem in the early part of this winter season, so the June, July, August. Flea beetles, cucumber beetles, there's a few others, but those are 2 you're going to see the most They attack heavily when the weather is hot, and they do a lot of foliar damage, sometimes even skeletonizing leaves if the population is dense enough. Beetles can transmit certain viral diseases, though they're less prone to doing that than leafhoppers and aphids are. Beetles are flying pests for the most part, and they are primarily nocturnal. So on a cloudy day, you might see them out and about quite late into the day. But on a sunny day, you'll see that they basically go hide under the leaves or in the ground during the hot part of the day, and they come up and they feed and active all night. So control is best achieved in the early evening and with insecticides that are modest in their persistence. So 4 or 5 day persistence like neem or pyrethrin for sprays. Also applying in the evening does reduce your risk of pollinator damage because they're not flying by that late in the evening. Pea weevils are a little different. They're a fused wing beetle, terrestrial. And you still need to monitor for populations. Your controls are basically the same, except this is mostly a cool season problem. So you spray any time of the day you can make it happen and really drench the plants with neem if you're seeing pea weevil damage. If you can get the plants up and growing vigorously in March, get them through that really cold spell, most of the time you'll be past the point where pea weevils are a significant problem. The primary symptom is what they call scalloping. And normally pea is almost smooth round on each of the lobes of the leaf, and they'll just be semicircularly notched all around the leaf edge from pea weevil feeding. Caterpillars are surprisingly hard to see in the garden. So cabbage moth and cabbage butterfly are big pests out here for caterpillars in these crops. The larvae mimic the vein structure and the coloration of the leaf. So they're laying there either on the edges of the leaf or alongside the veins, and they're doing chewing damage. We don't worry too much about disease spread from them from their type of feeding patterns, but they do a lot of leaf damage to the point where they can really stunt a crop substantially. You can hand catch caterpillars if your eyes are good and you're patient. They respond really well to a special class of insecticides, Bt and spinosad, that are larval insect controls only. So good organic insecticides. So you'll see Captain Jack's dead bug is a good spinosad-based insecticide, or Bt, Bacillus thuringiensis. Slugs damage is typically moderate in the driest part of the summer, but increases as the rains come in. It's worth controlling early, however. What slugs are present and laying eggs in the summer contributes dramatically to your fall and winter slug populations. Barriers can work, copper barriers, crushed shells, things like that. I find in the scale I garden that's pretty impractical, but it is theoretically possible. Baits. I will not use metaldehyde in my vegetable garden. It is too poisonous. I do not approve. Iron phosphate baits. Sluggo. They're not only much safer for people and pets. In the cold part of the season, they're substantially more effective. So metaldehyde baits are paralents. They paralyze a slug or a snail until it dehydrates to death. Well, if you paralyze a slug or a snail in October, it never dehydrates to death. Eventually that wears off. You don't kill very many that way. Iron phosphate baits are stomach poisons. They ingest it, they fairly soon stop feeding, they crawl away and they die. You don't see they don't have the satisfaction of dead slugs shriveling on the soil surface, but it's overall more effective in the colder, wetter parts of the season. Aphids and thrips are chronic problems. There's a surprising number of thrips. Floral thrips in your roses, iris thrips. Thrips are a huge problem on certain classes of vegetables, onions in particular we worry about, sometimes spinach. These are both sucking type feeders, so they have that substantial risk of transmitting viral diseases when they do that, especially aphids are infamous for that. The key to these really is there's no prevention for these ubiquitous pests. There's just so many of them around, you'll never really not have them. There's no substitute for being out in the garden regularly and noticing early stages of infestation and dealing with it then. Because once you've got 2,000 aphids, you're gonna have a heck of a time getting them under control. But if you got 20 aphids, you might have a fighting chance. The thrips are a summer problem primarily. The aphids don't really stop, they just slow down. Aphids are a funny one. A lot of the aphids you'll see go through a stage of their winged fertile females. They fly around. They're live birthing rather than laying eggs. So that's why your populations grow so fast. So a couple of generations of live birthing with higher and higher percentages of male in each generation. They'll go back to a standard mating process and egg laying process, and then the cycle starts all over again. So that's why the populations boom so bad. By the time you notice aphids on a plant, you usually have 2 or 3 generations present, including some eggs. So doing a couple of applications of insecticide are in order. Controls for aphids: removal of affected leaves, individual hand control of aphids, very early infestations that is possible. Next step, just water under pressure. They're very susceptible to predation. They don't move fast. They're really lots of different things eat them. If you can watch them off the leaves and crevices they're hiding in, they will be predated upon usually faster than they reattach to something else. Then insecticides, they're very easy to kill individually. It's just the mass and volume of them that makes them hard. Insecticidal soaps, neem, again, I carry neem all the time because that's my kind of go-to insecticide. It's got about 5 days of residual activity. It's very bee safe. You need to apply 2 or 3 applications of insecticide at about 4 or 5 days apart to catch enough aphid population to matter. Leaf miners spraying doesn't work. When you first start seeing leaf miner tunnels in your leaves, you can take off whole leaves or tear out portions of leaf that are infected. But that's only part of the story because you're only seeing the ones that have already hatched and begun tunneling. So keep an eye on it for the next couple of weeks and keep doing that. You can get them under control that way. I find it more practical at the moment I start seeing any substantial amount of tunneling is to remove the entire affected leaf as much as that's practical for the age of the crop in question, and then just immediately throw a cover over it. You'll still get 1 or 2 hatches out of eggs that are in the leaf surface, but you've stopped any new ones from coming in and laying new eggs. If you keep them covered for about 2 or 3 weeks, you'll go through an entire cycle of leaf miners. Yeah, you'll still have a problem maybe again 3 weeks after that, but you can interrupt a whole batch of feeding cycle just with covers. So lots going on in the garden in the fall and winter and overwinter. What about the rest of the garden? You're not going to winter garden your whole garden if for no other reason that you still have crops in the ground that you're harvesting in October. So that space isn't there. Protect and conserve your soil quality using mulches, leaf mulches, or artificial mulches, or using cover crops. That cover cropping should happen before you finish the end of your summer harvest. Back in August, early September is when you need to be putting your cover crop seed out for good cover. You seal right into the standing crops. They'll sprout slowly as you finish harvesting out and removing those crops. Cover crops can also help deter certain pests. Garden symphylan is a notorious problem. And this problem can build up, especially in no-till gardens, because the soil is not getting broken deep enough. Cover crops like grains, which really do kind of require tilling in, deter symphylans. But if you're practicing no-till gardening, use some vetch. Vetch is a good cover crop for symphylan deterrent, and you can just literally chop and hoe it and just leave it on the soil surface and just plant right through it in a couple of weeks after cutting. You do not have to turn it in for the benefit of the cover crop. Besides the advantages from crop deterrence and so overall soil quality, many cover crops either scavenge nutrients from the soil, keep them up in the foliage mass for you to work in again later so they don't just wash out over time, or actually net add nutrients like legume cover crops like clover that actually add nitrogen from the air into the soil. So that's your fall and winter gardening. At this point, I would entertain any questions either from the people here in the room or if anybody wants to either type in the chat bar or open up their mics to talk online. Anything?
That's a lot of information.
Yeah. This, of course, if you got your coupons here in the classroom, and for folks online, they got a similar coupon for indulging online shopping. So this is a 1 day only for those coupons. Feel free to make use of them for the class day. This class is recorded. We will be posting it on our website, like we do our YouTube channel, like we do with all of our classes. So it will be available for repeat reference as needed. Enjoy, besides all the things on our YouTube, look up Territorial Seed. company, Cottage Grove. They have a lot of info on winter gardening. Their website is very, very good and well oriented for that. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.